Edward the First. Let's talk about Edward the First here. He was not the first. From the beginning of the 12th century, kings began to take stock of their exchequer. Now, even new orders from on high, as did English nobs in their great piles in the country. Now, monks as well, hidden small records in their habits, not really in their habits, in the slightest, but it's a bit sort of I don't know. Well, they might have done anyway. Perhaps all this shows a tightening of Blighty in general, and the days and nights on the tiles. We should examine that today, methinks. I don't know. Eddy did everything large. Compensation for the stress he was under, having followed from his old, hugely popular pater, sending him to a spiral of anxiety and depression. Now, this is what I mean by heat. Heat does not go with anxiety and depression at all, or maniacal mania, or that sort of thing. He had a porker of a parliament, a sound of security more, a large train about town when meeting the villagers, and he was very good at that, meeting villagers in the English social structure. But he did expel the Jews from their homeland. Now we're going through something like that today, and that's getting quite big. I shall cover that some other juncture. I'm not entirely sure, but he was big in fear itself, pounding the theory that he had something to prove to English social structure in general, and binding the land together. It might also be due to the fact that he had a lot to live up to. 4 other crowded chaps held the name before him, but that had been long before Norman Franco. Eddy had a large chip on his shoulder at the end of the day. From the moment he popped, indeed. No, he did get stuff done. Not far enough to finish Carnarvon Castle, obviously. I'm sorry, chaps, I've really got to get this hat up. It's really quite insane. Maybe not this hat so much. I like my hat. Maybe actually this. I mean, but we're really talking about Carnarvon Castle now. Now, it was 1239. 1239, when Eleanor of Provence gave birth to the young Eddy Sprogget, bursting with insecurities at being married to such a well-renowned king she was, who rejigged English shocks. It's hardly surprising that Eddy picked up so much anxiety as he rubbed against her side. Maters have a detrimentally disturbing effect on their sprogs. Now, yet, despite the fact that English racism was already rampant then, I mean, you only have to look at it in English society today, it was worse back then. Henry very much loved his Franco wife, an analysis which goes some way to snubbing the theory that love conquers all within the family unit. Stability is also a key factor to be considered here. Now, a study done in 1979 by Catherine Harris showed that over 80% of latchkey kids with ancestors had a high target jobs devolved by the middle age into schizophrenics or ASD sufferers. Now this reaches my initial point, and 70% of them found themselves in criminal circles. Now, being a latchkey sprog is very much like being the son and heir to a huge homestead. Pater's never around. It's partly the result of Harry's own father, King John, having died as a result of a civil war that saw Henry himself in some uncertainty during his youth. Even now, the spring of manhood, Harry laboured to find a name for his son. Coupled with that, it was not a trendsetter's name in 1239. Beatrice came in 1243. Eddy's brother in 1245 was named Edmund, and the king's brood was growing. So much so that nurses were overflowing too. A Hugh Giffard was Eddy's master, but he died before his 7th birthday. I don't know. Besides which, his lessons consisted mostly of social lessons, as they did back then. Social lessons and a little bit of sportsmanship, perhaps, but mostly sportsmanship, to be quite honest with you. Although care and education of kids was considered to be a dainty concern, strenuous education had to start somewhere, particularly when you're a prince, and this was probably it. religious reading and poetry was where we start here, and the ladies undertook this. He's schooled in history, mythology, numeracy, speaking and such. But it's interesting at this point to note that the English language wasn't actually really a language per se. In fact, it wasn't a language at all. It's a very young language, about 300, 400 years, maybe even 500 years old. It really is a very young language. So we're talking French here, and we're talking. He might even have been schooled in Latin, because you know. But then again, on the other hand, Latin was indeed the province of religious orders at this juncture. But it was in 1254 when Eddy had his first sea voyage and was on the front line of a scrap that was taking place with Spain at the time. Though he was so hyped in the upset sense of the word that at his forthcoming nuptials, for an anxious individual who was still trying desperately to validify his existence in his father's eyes. Though after the wedding day, they went back a snail's trail, I think, to France. Eddy felt he had paid his tally and had no need to dash home, even for tea. Instead, when he arrived in Gascony, Eddy managed to get himself hailed as a sort of ruler and prince. This boasted his blistering confidence to no unparalleled degree, and since his parents were in blind, he had no worries on that score. Everything was not as sweet as roses as Eddy had anticipated. His father's intervention was constant and contributed to his fractured development that was already quite bad in itself. When Eddy was sent to Ireland to undertake the administration there was some debate as to whether it was a suitable destination for a Spanish princess. I mean, there would be, wouldn't there? However, even his pater would interfere, sending Eleanor springing back to Blighty. Even Christmas had its turbulent trials when Eddy and Harry broke out and spat over the prince's performance at a recent tournament. Now, this has been outlined before. The tournaments were a massive deal. I mean, sportsmanship really was the thing. It was like massive. With the new year came in a new birth of Eddy's younger brother, Edmund, in 1256. Yet another infringement that Ed had to endure over his insecurities and rights on primogeniture. On the horizon was also the fledgling Scottish problem, but that was in years to come. Only 17, and all was turmoil and confusion for Eddy. It wouldn't get any better. The instance of this kind of abusive and a fractured, toxic parental paranoia in relationships can be almost skimmed through. Harry and his sons, Rich, John and Jeff, were a prime example. The rows and wars over progenitors and principalities flourished throughout their realm and separate reigns. I've done a previous article on this subject. I'll leave a link in the YouTube thingy. However, Eddy is our prime concern at the moment, our prime concern. In 1258, William de Montfort's efforts to incite a coup because of parliamentary reforms, Eddy decided to take up the banner against his pater as well as all of that. Together with William de Valence, Eddy decided to reward those around him. As a result, he was blasted with a serious hole on the money bag by 1261. So he had no choice but to suckle up to his parents yet again. Quite a sozzle to bring yourself so far down just to resort to bowing before the very shackles you're rallying against in the first place. Just another tear in the forging hair shirt of independence for Eddy. It set him back in his noggin several years. Now, in 1264, Eddy was disposed to recognising the birth of a healthy son. It was the 14th of July in Windsor, and just having helped put down yet another rebellion by Simon de Montfort, Eddy was aghast and dumbfounded by the idea that he now had responsibility himself to introduce a child to the throne. He had barely even grasped the shackles himself. Insecurity raised its ugly bolts yet again, but in 1267 the rebellion remained starchy and Edward looked on the situation in Ely, where the outlaws were quivered. Though it seems that Eddy's lack of assertiveness was turning. In 1268, he reflected that Pater was almost 59. He had surely proven his worth by now. How much longer would the depressive and anxious prince have to wait before he could assert his true purpose to the people? Now, we reflect that this position and how important it is to find a sole meaning and validify the external situ that Eddy was crunched up in. Phil Zimbardo, whom I often talk, asserts his Lucifer effect and the consequences of taking on someone else's scrap for peace. Now, this is a salient point because when Eddy borrowed money from the Jews in 1269, he transferred a stash of his enmity to the group. As Christians were forbidden to practice usury and borrowing, banking basically, it fell to these chaps, the Jews. Now we have a massive thing going on with all this at the moment. I'm not going to branch into that because it's really not quite the ticket. But still incredibly haunted over his pater's death, fractured and split as to how to feel. Now, in the spring of 1271, a still divided Eddy decided to man up, if that's the phrase I want. Approaching the world now with an increasing close and internal locus, Eddy sought solace and purpose in the Provence of Gascony, in Franconville. The French Crusades were returning early, and Louis IX had just bought it, so he had to be extra careful in his approach. To find a purposeful mission, Eddy set out to deal a blow to the de Montfort brothers who had resurfaced in France. Guy had been dubbed the governor of Tuscany, while Simon was working for Charles of Anjou, burning with the desire for bloody revenge for his father and the stress that had been put on him over the de Montfort revolt. Eddy eventually caught up with Guy and lobbed him in prison with papal help. A lot of papal help was needed in those days. With papal help, a knot of positivity under his belt and a notch on his crown. Assertiveness on Eddy was booming, together with a vicious streak burning from the tragedy that would now forever shroud him. It was in 1273 there was yet another rebellion in Gascony. Blighters everywhere, and Eddy was forced to step up yet again. Gascon de Berne, a massive landowner in the area, had a dispute with Luc de Tournai over lands he held during the Crusades. Now, a lot of lands were held during the Crusades, and they were stolen away when people went off to do their thing, and they came back to find that their picket fence was nicked or something, or their lands had been sequestered by the crown, or anything could have happened. But this kicked off over that kind of scenario. Eddy found himself in the middle of it. Now this was the problem, because the Duke refuted Eddy's authority, and that's why it happened. The blinder of the situation was that although Gascon calmed down a few rounds later, he had already broken the terms of the surrender to his pile in the Pyrenees. Eventually, though, he was brought to heel with a decisive moment as Eddy's jaunt to assertive fields. He gave up in 1274 anyway, and Eddy went home. His reception was similar to that. Eddy's reception was similar to the Richard Lionheart, who's all those rounds ago, and it boosted his soul to some great degree. Now, his coronation as well was overdue, considering how long he'd been away. And on Saturday, 8th of August, Eddy had plonked himself in London. It was only in 1275 the next big project was hoisting ahead of Eddy. Having launched himself out of the doldrums of grief, it struck the knightly crown that the way in which one of his pater would be to continue his doings. In that it was important to culminate a census, something solidifying the platform on which Eddy could start the reform of the Parliament that Blighty needed so badly at this time. the Great Statute was pushed in on Westminster soon after Easter, and it arrowed to resort to the monarchy and his right to improve law and order. Now, obviously, as I've said before, Eddy was really big on law and order. This bled strongly into the continual desire to find a new stamp of approval. Jewish money lending was banned altogether in October, and Eddy tried desperately to limit it to animal murderers, although the things that were pointed at them were blindingly false. Blighty became too hot to handle them, and a lifestyle as simple merchants was simply not in the Jewerated any longer. A warlike scrap took place, and it was a shiner. Though it was not until 1277 that Llewellyn offered to pay £7,333 for Eddy's goodwill. But the problem was, this didn't include money that Eddy owed for the previous treaty. The proclamation of peace on the 9th of November had King Llewellyn ap Grefad bow down to Eddy. On April the 8th, 1278, Eddy sent Master Mason James of St George to Wales to establish new castles on the outskirts of the country, and a great and good boundary to the area. Paranoid, I suppose. But the fracturing still remained. It was a defeat from a personal point of view, and it continued his tradition of needing a constant supply of external validity. These castles, though, were not lonely outposts that harboured lots of big-headed English knights, but administrative centres that held sway to Chichester. Blighty ideals were refrained from splashing about all over the place. It was a very amiable setup. Eddy just didn't want any hassle. He wanted stability. He wanted an England that was solidified in a kind of conservatism. Llewellyn was still regarded as sus at Chrissy, though, and in 1279 Geoffrey of Monmouth decided to subsume the myth of Arthur to Blighty legend. He made out that Arthur belonged to the Welsh, and the ancestors of them were the main characters. Eddy had a problem with this and was fuming. He was literally fuming. Not only was Glastonbury deleted from the legend, but it was told in such a way that Blighty blokes almost had nothing to do with it at all. Does this remind anyone of anything? Today, perchance? And the recent doings at Glastonbury of this year? However, this didn't hold Eddy from making his pilgrimage to Glastonbury at that rounder. But in October... Was it October? Yes. In October, Eddy looked at his account. As I'm to do... Oh my God, yes. Eddy looked at his account. Now, it was nasty. The bags were virtually empty. Mostly because of his recent disputes. This didn't help matters in his noggin at all. He didn't want to pilfer from Parliament, so he decided to fiddle the situation by running a new coining system. Now this was very interesting indeed, very interesting, and quite fascinating in the way in which he did it. He remitted the old coins with his pater's visage on them and established new ones. It was a success, and wasn't even illegal, and totally above board. Lessons learned from the Hebrew chaps after all, methinks. It was 1280 when he went on a progress on a tour of the northern part of the country with Eleanor. Good appearances in a pro-man campaign are always good, even to this day. This boosted his faltering ego after the events of the past few years, though in 1282 the Welsh probe reared his ugly head again. Not only were the British castles rocketing around the marches, but Llewellyn felt he was growing increasingly older and more frail, and so therefore he was a little insecure in this particular respect. At 61, the bigwig found that his wife had died in childbirth. The loss of a potential spork made life increasingly difficult for him. In reflection of all this, Llewellyn decided to invade Blighty yet again, When Eddy heard of this infraction, he said, the Welsh are unmindful. They're unmindful of their own salvation. They fed us of their going back on their word, basically. But in 1282, Eddy got the church involved yet again, and it was a disaster. Priests and nuns, monks and clerics were slaughtered. Eddy would not sit and take this. He offered an earldom if the Llewellyn would break up the fight, backing down and trying to find a peaceful yet walkover solution to a confrontational problem. Yet again, though before the Welsh heard of his hand, Llewellyn attacked from the hills of Snowdonia, and Eddy finally lost his rag and subdued the Welsh to the highest degree. His temper had reached its limits. On Llewellyn's death in 1283, Eddy took Aberystwyth, and as a result, the castle of Carnarvon, being built in the memory of the Emperor Constantine and his father Magnus Maximus. The walls they were designed to resemble the aspect of Constantinople. It was 1284, and Eddy arrived at the castle to inspect its construction. Thoughts of insecurity and a fractured sense of independence were beginning to diminish, but there still remained the trauma of it. Of course, Edward still needed validification for what he saw as his sins, so he recreated Arthur's crown through the magic of his royal goldsmiths. Magical stability. Magical stability. Unfortunately, this intent was to get his son and heir, Alfonso, to present it at Westminster Abbey at the shrine of Eddy the Confessor. Now, it was only when Eddy the First had his hopes up that he found them dash when on the 22nd of August at Carnarvon Castle he was informed of Alfonso's death. Now, with Alfonso swiftly buried at Westminster Abbey, Eddy steadily found himself getting accustomed to disappointment and pain on this scale. After a long and protracted war, Eddy was getting ever so slightly tired of it all, as anyone would. But then, when Ireland began its troubles, he became decidedly sickened. The time moved on, and Eddy's insecurity turned to greater anger still. His Queen Eleanor bore him more children and stomached his impatience somewhat. It was now 1290, and Eddy was now fed up with the continuing Jewish problem. They had not obeyed his determined attempt to subjugate them and get them to abide by lawful trade, nor had they left Blighty. Now they had taken up usury yet again, and it seemed their influence was affecting even the royal treasury this time. Eddy determined that he coped enough. In the same rounder that Eddy's daughter Margaret married John of Brabant, Eddy expelled the Jews completely from his blighted land under taxation pretenses of going to the Crusades, rather like so many other bigwigs in other powers that done before him. Then, in 1293, Eddy's queen fell disastrously ill. Things couldn't get any worse, could they? It was October when the Queen contracted fever and died. Such a splitting of anguish Eddy had never felt. All was not over for him, though. John Balliol was about to rid his troublesome head. He was renowned forever for being the monarch that solved his problems with his fists. His tomb bears the infamous inscription Edwardus Primus Scotorum Malleus Hic Es. The legend reads Pactum Servera. His death was caused officially from dysentery whilst on campaign in Scotland, but the outcome could be misconstrued as a bit dumb. A good reason was that he faded away from absolute exhaustion of the fight. A fight to maintain equilibrium, a solidarity, a conservative stance, a good stability for the honour of the throne in England. and his pater's legacy. See you later, chaps. Give us a good clicking.
Shakanaka.